know Vladimir Putin. You think he's a killer?
I do.
Будьте здоровы. Я желаю ему здоровья. Говорю это без иронии, без шутки.
I'm not looking for conflict with Russia, but that we will respond if Russia continues its harmful activities.
У нас отношения двусторонние деградировали до самой низкой планки за последние годы.
After a week of engagements in the G7, NATO and Europe, it is time for the showstopper. U.S. President Joe Biden will meet Russian President Vladimir Putin, two leaders who not very long ago called each other killers. Last time they met, in the same place by the way, Biden told Putin he had no soul. How do you talk policy with a man you've called names for years? We'll find out soon enough. Both sides are setting the tone. One says we do not want conflict. The other says we want a predictable relationship. The hostility we know is too old and deep-seated to be eased by the romantic setting of Switzerland. On Gravitas tonight, we'll discuss what they bring to the table, Biden and Putin. We'll also tell you about past presidential encounters and how they've shaped the U.S. Russia relationship. Also on the show, China is facing international heat, and the woman at the center of the pandemic storm is Dr. Shi Zhengli. Better known as China's Batwoman, she's given a new interview. We'll tell you what she said. 1 year since the Galwan clash, where do relations between India and China stand? How has the conflict changed India's China strategy? We'll bring you a special report. Will Sweden and Denmark become Muslim-majority countries in a few years? The Czech Prime Minister's statement has triggered a storm. And for the second time in a week, India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar is visiting Qatar. We'll tell you what's cooking. We begin as always with Gravitas Global Headlines.
As U.S. President Joe Biden shores up European allies before his contentious talks with Russia's Vladimir Putin, a U.S. aircraft carrier enters the South China Sea. The U.S. Navy says the carrier group led by the USS Ronald Reagan is in the South China Sea as part of a routine mission. This as ties between Washington and Beijing are at an all-time low. Israel's new government approves a controversial march by Jewish nationalists through annexed East Jerusalem. The March of the Flags will see Israeli far-right groups walking through occupied East Jerusalem's Old City into its Muslim quarter. The march has drawn warnings from Hamas of fresh hostilities. Utter chaos ensues during the budget session in Pakistan as government figures and opposition nearly come to blows, throwing copies of the budget at each other. Earlier, Pakistan's opposition parties had vowed to not let the budget for 2021 to 2022 pass through the National Assembly. After facing a backlash over its changing terms and conditions for users, Facebook-owned WhatsApp launches its first major privacy ad campaign in the UK. The messaging app has been facing pressure from governments, including India, to change its policy on encrypted messages. Amid renewed discussions on Islamophobia in Canada, the Attorney General charges the man accused of killing 4 members of a Muslim family with terrorism. Authorities say the suspect intentionally targeted the family because of their faith, running them over in his vehicle. Egypt's highest civilian court upholds the death sentences of 12 Muslim Brotherhood members who were convicted in a mass trial in 2018. The men were sentenced for involvement in a sit-in protest in 2013 that was dispersed by security forces in a violent operation that left hundreds dead. The sentences cannot be appealed. Citing a risk of rabies, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention temporarily bans dogs from being imported into the U.S. from more than 100 countries. This as the agency observed a rise in inadequate rabies vaccination certificates from other countries. Social distancing and forgotten masks cast aside, nearly 9,000 students in Wuhan huddled together for a mass graduation ceremony. This more than a year after the Chinese city was put under one of the world's strictest lockdowns. Coronavirus first emerged in Wuhan in late 2019. Athletes and contingent officials face the possibility of financial sanctions and even expulsion from the Tokyo Olympics if they breach COVID-19 protocols. Organizers released the third and final edition of their playbook, containing rules for those residing within the Olympic Village. Failure to adhere to physical distancing norms, going to places not included in a 14-day activity plan, and refusal to undertake tests will attract sanctions. Argentina's quest for a record-equaling 15th Copa America title has begun with a 1-1 draw against Chile in Rio de Janeiro. Lionel Messi put the Argentines ahead with a magnificent free kick in the first half that gave him his 73rd international goal. But Eduardo Vargas equalized just before the hour mark by bundling in the rebound from an Arturo Vidal penalty. Argentina face Uruguay next on Friday.
Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, two presidents who have called each other killers, are set to meet. What will happen when they come face to face? Will they be weighed down by history as they forge an equation for the future? And when I say history, I mean decades of antagonism. Also multiple efforts to contain the conflict. One of them at the very same venue where Putin and Biden are set to meet now. This was way back in 1985. U.S. President Ronald Reagan met with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. It was a historic Cold War-era summit. Both sides agreed to cut nuclear arsenal. 26 years later, the same villa hosted another summit. The year was 2011. Joe Biden met Vladimir Putin in 2011. Back then, Biden was America's vice president. Putin was serving as Russia's prime minister after completing 2 terms as president. And you should know this. That's because Russia had presidential term limits then. The law did not allow Putin to carry on as president for a 3rd term, so he chose to be prime minister for a while. And he put a trusted aide in the presidential chair. And that is how Prime Minister Putin met Vice President Biden in the year 2011. The leaders smiled before the camera, but behind it, they were cold. So much so that Biden told Putin that he had no soul. That was 10 years ago. Now Biden and Putin are meeting again at the same Swiss villa. Not much has changed since their last meeting, except perhaps their designation. The U.S. Russia relationship is at an all-time low. So if a détente is what you were hoping for, you were hoping for too much. America's list of complaints is rather long this time. It accuses Russia of meddling in the 2016 presidential election. It blames Russia for a string of cyber attacks on U.S. government infrastructure. It opposes Moscow's aggression towards Ukraine, and it certainly does not welcome the jailing of Alexei Navalny. Biden wants to challenge Putin on all these 4 issues. So this meeting is basically to manage the crisis, to make America's relationship with Russia more stable, more predictable. Before going to Geneva, the U.S. president said that he was not looking for a fight, but he won't shy away from one if it comes to that.
I shared with our allies that I'll convey to President Putin, that I'm not looking for conflict with Russia, but that we will respond if Russia continues its harmful activities. And we will not fail to defend the transatlantic alliance or stand up for democratic values.
Biden is not the only one setting the tone here. The Russian president has given 2 interviews ahead of the summit, and he had a lot to say. Putin is dealing with his fifth American president here. He has had summits with 4 of Biden's predecessors. The last one was Donald Trump, seen as a friend of Moscow. Putin had called Trump, and I'm quoting, an extraordinary individual, a talented individual, a colorful individual. What about Biden? What has the Russian president said about Joe Biden? After having referred to him as a killer, Putin called Biden a career man and a different kind of person. That's an understatement. Putin went on to say that there will be some advantages, some disadvantages, but there won't be any impulse-based movements on behalf of the sitting U.S. president, meaning Biden is expected to be predictable and that Russia will deal with him on its own terms.
У нас отношения двусторонние.
We have a bilateral relationship that has deteriorated to what is the lowest point in recent years. I am inclined to think that despite all these niceties, the United States, as far as their relationship with Russia is concerned, will be promoting what they consider important and necessary for themselves. Above all, for themselves, in their economic, political and military interests. However, to hear what the allies have to say probably never hurts. This is a working procedure.
Почему мы предлагаем договариваться?
Ahead of the summit, Putin also denied all charges that Biden has made against him, whether it was the cyber attacks or the attempted assassination of Alexei Navalny and the crackdown on dissent. Vladimir Putin defended all criticism by focusing on America's own failures. The Russian president accused the U.S. of creating instability in Libya, Afghanistan and Syria. He also backed the Black Lives Matter movement. Politics can make you woke. So this is what we end up with. Biden is ready with his ammo and Putin is prepared to push back. This should be an interesting encounter and we'll be watching and reporting. And as we count down to that encounter, let's also take a look at how such summits have played out in the past, right from the Yalta Conference of 1945, where Franklin D. Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin chalked out an end to the Second World War, to the 1985 Geneva summit, where President Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev discussed an end to the Cold War, the frosty Obama-Putin summit of 2016, and the too friendly Trump-Putin summit in 2018. Here's a report on the history of U.S.-Russia relations and the presidential encounters that have shaped them.
You know Vladimir Putin. You think he's a killer?
I do.
A few weeks ago, Joe Biden called Vladimir Putin a killer who will shortly pay the price.
You know Vladimir Putin. You think he's a killer?
I do.
So what price must he pay?
The price he's going to pay, well, you'll see shortly.
Now he's calling him a bright, tough and worthy adversary.
He's bright, he's tough, and I have found that he is as they say, when he used to play ball, a worthy adversary.
The US president's evolving remarks on his Russian counterpart are symbolic of how Russia and America have dealt with each other for decades. Containing differences that can spark a conflict. Agreeing to disagree to prevent the world from slipping into chaos. The first presidential meeting was that of allies. America and the Soviet Union fought the Second World War as allies. In 1945, when Nazi Germany was nearing defeat, they met to discuss ways to end the war. US President Franklin D. Roosevelt was joined by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill as he met with Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin in the Crimean town of Yalta. The three men chalked out an end to the World War. What followed was the beginning of the Cold War. Within 2 years, Washington and Moscow were on the opposite sides. The next big meeting took place 4 decades later. After 40 years of a bitter Cold War and stockpiling of nuclear arms, US President Ronald Reagan met Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev at a summit hosted in Geneva, Switzerland. The two leaders, who are said to have shared a good chemistry, decided to embrace the idea of common security. A term used to assert how the two sides can find security only through cooperation and not conflict. This summit led to the mutual reduction of nuclear armament and improvement of diplomatic ties.
Mr. President, do you agree with your Chief of Staff that...
Some say it may also have laid the groundwork for the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In 2001, the newly appointed US President George W. Bush travelled all the way to Slovenia to meet the newly appointed Russian President Vladimir Putin. This summit was aimed at resolving differences spanning decades. The warmth between the two new faces in global politics surprised many. A few months later, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, Putin is said to have been one of the first world leaders to offer Bush support in the war against terrorism. But the friendship didn't last. America's support for NATO enlargement is said to have angered Russia. Moscow later objected to the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. In 2016, outgoing US President Barack Obama had a frosty interaction with Putin, who had now been in power for 16 years. Their meeting took place on the sidelines of the G20 summit in China. Russia's territorial aggressions in Ukraine, its ongoing crackdown on domestic dissidents, and rumors that it was seeking to meddle in the 2016 US presidential polls cast a shadow on the discussions. This was illustrated by the ice-cold stares the two men gave each other. But if Obama saw Russians as clear-cut villains, the next president's attitude seemed quite the opposite. In 2018, Donald Trump met with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki and contradicted all notions of Russia meddling in America's internal affairs. The notion of an American president giving Putin's denial more importance than the work of the US intelligence community angered many. Trump was forced to walk back on his comments. Putin, who has been in power for 20 years, will now be meeting his fourth US president in Joe Biden, who will naturally be coming with a list of grievances. Is Biden's changing tone an indication of America's changing approach? We shall learn soon enough. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
The Russian rivalry is every US president's inheritance. It's been the case since the Second World War. But the last two presidents had a second rivalry to manage, the one with China. For all the differences between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, both men agreed on one thing: taming the dragon was critical. Donald Trump had its own approach: wage a battle with or without allies. Biden, though, is looking for partners. And that was his message at both the G7 and the NATO summits: a coalition of democracies against China. Now, not every American ally is convinced with this approach. The joint communiqué from NATO does not mention the term Cold War, but they see China as a security challenge.
China's growing influence and international policies presents challenges to alliance security. Leaders agreed that we need to address such challenges together as an alliance, and that we need to engage with China to defend our security interests.
How is China responding to all of this? Is it rattled? In the past, Beijing has brushed off criticism, called it outdated Cold War mentality. But now that NATO is game, does China have the appetite? What is the propaganda press saying? The Global Times called the G7 delusional. CGTN ran the headline, Biden's Cornwall crusade falls flat. Now, all these articles have one thing in common. It's not the usual bravado and firebrand rhetoric. China is almost playing the victim card, a peace-loving Asian powerhouse being villainized by the West. Even the Chinese Foreign Ministry is using this tone.
Forming cliques, engaging in group politics and drawing lines based on ideology, and forcing other countries to pick sides. This goes against the trend of the times of peaceful development and cooperation, and is doomed to unpopularity and failure.
Now, these are definitely uncertain times for Beijing. The G7 and NATO dealt them two separate blows. One, an alternative to the Belt and Road. This jeopardizes China's plan for world domination. No more checkbook diplomacy and debt traps. And two, NATO's declaration that China is a global security challenge. Being on NATO's radar is not good news. This is the most powerful military alliance in history. So coming back to the question, is China rattled? Well, it should be. Until now, an alliance against China was limited to op-eds and books. This week, it became a reality. And this is not just about the G7 and NATO. These sentiments are echoed worldwide, in India, in South Korea, in Australia. These countries are not NATO or G7 members, but they share the vision of a rules-based democratic order. So China will definitely be worried. But it's not game over yet. There was a glimmer of hope at both the G7 and NATO, and it came from Europe. Joe Biden's game plan hinges on his allies supporting him, but once again, Europe finds itself on the wrong side of history. The French president says China is not in the Atlantic, hence it is not a threat. This is a bizarre approach to global security. It is also a double standard. Here is what Macron said about Russia. And I'm quoting, "We have to define clear red lines with Russia. After unacceptable behavior, we need sanctions. You see, Russia borders the European Union, so it is a security threat. China is far away, so it's not." Beijing has noticed this hesitancy from Europe. It is looking to drive a wedge between the allies. Look at what the Chinese spokesperson said. He believes Europe will never join America's war chariot.
The US is trying to draw ideological lines to form small groups targeting China. But the US and the European Union have different interests. The European Union is an independent body. Just now you mentioned the relevant European Union countries. They will not tie themselves to the anti-China war chariot of the United States.
China's plan makes sense on paper. A divided NATO will be a much weaker threat. But what are the chances of that happening? By the end of the day, Europe and America are joined at the hip. Their militaries, their economies, it's all linked. If Joe Biden wants a Cold War, how long can Europe resist? So this week's flurry of diplomacy is a warning to Beijing. Two things can happen now. One, China reforms itself and becomes a responsible regional power, highly unlikely. And two, they continue on this war path and NATO changes its tone. Well, right now, China is a security challenge. Next rung on the ladder is security threat. And here's something that we did not expect. China's Batwoman, Xi Jinping, has spoken out, finally, for several weeks. The world has been discussing a lab leak. A lot of circumstantial evidence has emerged. There are serious questions about the Wuhan lab. All this while Xi Jinping had remained silent. Now, America is conducting its own investigation into the origins of the pandemic, and China's Batwoman is offering a rather feeble defense of her risky research. Recent reports suggest that Xi Jinping has been hiding a lot from the world. Our next report tells you why China's Batwoman is under global scrutiny and what she has to say in her defense.
Xi Jinping dedicated her life to research on bat coronaviruses. Over the years, Dr. Xi has identified several SARS-like viruses. Her work earned her the title of China's Batwoman. But now the same title hangs like an albatross around her neck. Xi Jinping has become a person of interest in a global hunt for the origins of the Wuhan virus. She is, after all, China's Batwoman. In April 2012, 6 miners fell ill after visiting a bat-infested copper mine in China's Yunnan province. Their symptoms were consistent with the Wuhan virus. 3 of them died. Shi Zhengli and her team from the Wuhan Institute of Virology were called in to investigate. In the years that followed, scientists from the Wuhan lab collected hundreds of samples from bats in their hunt for more bat coronaviruses. But one sample stood out. It was in February 2020, 8 years after the incident at the Yunnan mine, that Shi Zhengli revealed its existence. Called the RATG13, this sample was 96.2% similar to the Wuhan virus. In a paper, Dr. Shi revealed that they had found this virus in a bat in Yunnan, but she didn't reveal when they collected it. Now experts are calling on Dr. Shi to explain. What was she doing with these samples inside the Wuhan lab? Some scientists say Dr. Shi's work fits the broad definition of gain-of-function research, where viruses are modified and made more infectious to gauge how they can infect the human body. Now Dr. Shi has come out with a denial in an interview to an American newspaper. China's Batwoman says she did no wrong. She claims no gain-of-function was carried out in her labs. And how can she offer up any evidence for something when there is no evidence? But can we take Dr. Shi's word for it? When investigators from the World Health Organization visited the Wuhan lab, Dr. Shi told them that there was no compromise on safety. Researchers study viruses only after donning full protective gear. But in 2018, she had a different take. She said that researchers didn't use full protective gear all the time. In the slides that went along with her speech, some researchers were working with bats, with bare hands, and without masks. The inconsistencies in her story and the dangerous research that she conducted have put Dr. Shi at the center of a global quest for the origins of the virus. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
They say there are 2 ways to win elections: promise hope or predict doom. The Prime Minister of the Czech Republic believes in the latter. He is predicting doom, the end of a homogeneous Christian Europe. We are talking about this man, Andrej Babiš. He's been the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic since 2017, a billionaire-turned-politician and no stranger to controversy. The Forbes magazine once called him the Czech Trump. But does he measure up to the real Donald? Well, the outlandish predictions are certainly there. A few days back, Prime Minister Babiš wrote an opinion piece on Europe's immigration policy. At least that was the intention. The article soon veered towards Islamophobia. It ended with 2 predictions. The Netherlands will become a Muslim-majority nation by 2044, and Sweden will meet the same fate in 2065. 2 quintessential European countries becoming Muslim nations. Does it sound unrealistic? It should, because it is. Here's how the population looks like in both these countries. 50% of the Dutch population do not believe in God. Christians make up 43%, Muslims 5%. What about Sweden? Around half the country follows Christianity, while 8% of Swedes are Muslims. The Czech Prime Minister is convinced that these numbers will explode. But demographers do not agree. This is what the Pew Research Institute found. Right now, 5% of Europe's population is Muslim. By 2050, it could reach 11%. In the case of Sweden, the Muslim population could reach anywhere between 11 to 30%. A sociologist at the Charles University in Prague says the Czech Prime Minister is completely wrong. He says Babiš is trying to scare people. It would not be a first for him. Last year, the Prime Minister had a similar prediction for Belgium. He said the country would have a Muslim majority by 2050. Again, a load of nonsense. If the science does not hold up, why is the Czech Prime Minister saying all of this? It's a classic case of fear-mongering, appealing to the worst tendencies of his people. The Czech Republic has traditionally opposed immigration. We saw this during the 2015 refugee crisis. The Czech government refused to accept the EU's migrant quota, and Andrej Babiš was deputy prime minister back then. Now he's back with the migrant rhetoric, right on time for another hateful campaign. elections in the Czech Republic are scheduled for October this year. Babiš already heads, in fact, a minority government. So he's resorted to Islamophobia to drum up support. And by doing this, he has opened Pandora's box. He has given fodder to the neo-Nazis in Europe. Two things that never end well. He has also set back Europe's campaign against extremism. Let me tell you how. Battling Islamist extremism is a delicate policy. The idea is to target the people, not the religion. And that's the fine line between Islamophobia and anti-terrorism. Muslims in Europe already feel alienated. They feel the state is targeting them for their beliefs. Comments like these fuel those fears. They defeat outreach programs and build tensions between communities. Some European governments have understood this. France, for example, has a robust policy to tackle extremism. But the government also embraces immigration and diversity. President Macron once said that France is not a fixed identity. It is always changing. But leaders like Babiš do not accept this. They're still holding on to Europe's colonial age, a white, Christian and racist Europe. They spread fear and panic. They make baseless predictions that Europe is becoming a Muslim continent. Not only are they wrong, they're setting off a movement they cannot control. Because when Europe goes right, there are no half measures. It is the 15th of June 2020, 1 year since the Galwan clash. It was on this day last year that the India-China standoff began, the worst standoff in almost 4 decades. 1 year on, where do things stand? What has changed and what hasn't? And what lies ahead for India's relationship with China? Let's start with the night when we broke the news of 20 Indian soldiers having been killed in Galwan. I'll start with the latest, and I'm afraid it's not good news. 20 Indian soldiers have been killed in the Galwan Valley. China too has lost men, almost the same number, including a commanding officer. We cannot confirm a number. The Chinese government won't give a figure. They never do. Clearly, this has gone too far, and India, we are told, is prepared for any eventuality. This is not 1962. This is not even 2017. India is better prepared, as I said, with a different playbook. And we are not in the business of warmongering. But the opposite of war is not always peace. Sometimes it is capitulation. And that's something to be avoided at all costs. We said it back then, the opposite of war is not always peace. Sometimes it is capitulation. 1 year and multiple reports later, we can tell you that India has not succumbed to Chinese threats. It is dealing with China in the only language that it understands, the language of strength. New Delhi's strategy has been multi-pronged. Let's take this one at a time, starting with the disengagement process. The first major breakthrough came in February 2021. After 11 rounds of military talks, China's defense ministry announced that it was ready for a synchronized and organized disengagement. And since then, both India and China have pulled back frontline troops from the Pangong Tso region. In fact, the north and south banks of Pangong Tso have been fully vacated. But there are still some outstanding issues and suspicions that remain. So India has not lowered its guard. The Indian Army continues with its enhanced troop deployment of more than 50,000 personnel. These soldiers, logistically and strategically are prepared to face any hostility. And so is the Indian Air Force. It remains battle-ready, operationally deployed against China with missiles, helicopters, fighter jets. They range from transport aircraft like the C-17 to choppers and Apaches like Apaches and Chinooks, and fighter jets, including the Rafale. Last week, we spoke to India's Chief of Defence Staff, General Bipin Rawat, and he told us that India's ultimate aim is to reverse to the April 2020 situation, what is called status quo ante.
Our bottom line is that we want to revert to April 2020 situation. And this is what has been communicated to the Chinese. So the ultimate aim is to ensure that we revert to status quo ante. Because if we revert to status quo ante, then there will be, some kind of belief in each other, some kind of satisfaction that it is not likely to lead to further escalation.
This was about the military front. What about India's diplomatic response to Chinese aggression? India is actively building coalitions with other nations. Take the Quad, for example, a strategic alliance between the US, Japan, Australia and India to counter China's aggressive military expansionism. The first meeting between Quad leaders took place in March this year. Now, reports suggest that the US president is looking to convene an in-person summit of this alliance. Meanwhile, India is also strengthening its ties with regional partners, countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. In October last year, India and Sri Lanka held the Slynex 20, a bilateral naval maritime exercise in the Indian Ocean. In March this year, India secured a strategic deep-sea port project in Sri Lanka, which will act as a counterweight to China's Colombo port city project. With Bangladesh, India conducted the Bongo Sagar exercise last year. This was in the Bay of Bengal, where China is trying to increase its naval presence. The Indian Prime Minister also visited Bangladesh 2 months back, his first foreign visit since the onset of the pandemic. It celebrated 50 years of India-Bangladesh ties. Then we come to the economic front, and this one's important. India has weaponized its market and hit China where it hurts the most. The steps include 1. Amending the FDI policy to prevent opportunistic takeovers, and this has brought down fund inflows from Chinese companies by 28%. 2. A digital strike. India banned Chinese apps, at least 200 of them, a move that reduced China's influence on India's internet economy. And 3. India has challenged China's pharma supremacy through vaccine Maitri. Scores of countries received the Made in India vaccine, something that the Chinese media has called a smear campaign. So, 1 year since the Galwan clash, India has fought China on all these fronts: military, security, economic, diplomatic, but not all gaps have been filled. The disengagement in Ladakh is still not complete. Yes, India is better placed, but there's no guarantee that China will not betray again. Plus, we still cannot decide if Chinese sponsors are more important than national interest. Time and again, we end up embarrassing ourselves by opting for Chinese brands and then retracting. Case in point, the IPL and India's Olympic kits. And then we have the military operations of the Quad. They remain moot. A lot is being said, but very little has been done to achieve the core strategic purpose of containing China's influence in the Indo-Pacific. So let me say this: fully resolving the conflict with China will be a long, drawn-out process, and if India wants to tilt the balance in its favor, it must mount an effective and sustained 360-degree response. And now let's talk about the slowest organism on the planet: bureaucracy. It's a big machine that simply refuses to move. In India, we're used to this deadlock. To get things done, you need to grease the wheels a bit. And that involves 2 questions. 1, can you pay bribes? And 2, do you know someone who can get the wheels moving? Now, put together, we call this corruption. Today, there are indices that measure corruption in countries, and there is one called the Corruption Perception Index. It ranks 180 countries in the world. Most of Europe ranks within the top 20. It makes you think that they are clean, vigilant societies. Turns out, Europe loves greasing the wheel too. And this pretense would have continued unnoticed if not for the Wuhan virus. As they say, crises can bring out the best and the worst in you. In Europe's case, it is the worst, consistently. Let me tell you the findings of a transparency survey conducted in Europe. This was between October and December last year. 40,000 people responded, so this is a big sample size. Nearly a third of them relied on personal connections to get health care. What does this mean? Basically, they knew someone. Maybe someone at the hospital or in the health ministry or with big pharma, someone who can get them treatment. In some countries, this number was higher. 54% of the people in the Czech Republic used their contacts to get health care. 46% in Portugal, 41% in Hungary. Think about it, almost half the people in these countries jumped the queue. During a health crisis, this can be disastrous. Vaccines and healthcare are supposed to prioritize the vulnerable population. It doesn't matter if you know the health minister or if your friend works at the clinic. When well-connected people jump the line, they're denying critical care to patients. They're endangering lives. And we've seen this repeatedly during the pandemic, especially in Europe. In Spain, top health officials resigned after they jumped the queue. In Germany, the government had to threaten legal action against queue jumpers. Why is this happening? And why so much in Europe? Write it down to European entitlement. They had money, they had power, they had connections, so obviously it was their right to get treatment first. That's the thought process here. And if connections did not work, they were happy to flash the wallet. 6% people in the survey reported paying bribes for healthcare. In some countries, this number was significantly higher, 22% in Romania, 19% in Bulgaria, and 17% in Hungary. Does Europe still think that corruption is an Asian phenomenon or an African problem? Because it isn't. The survey chief summed it up perfectly. And I'm quoting here, the EU is often seen as a bastion of integrity, but these findings show that countries across the region remain vulnerable to the insidious effects of corruption. It basically means Europe too is corrupt. People there are slowly waking up to this reality. In the same survey, 62% people said that corruption was a major problem in the government. 76% said the situation was not improving. This is worrying for a lot of reasons. One, imagine the amount of money flowing through the EU, a combined budget of more than $1 trillion. This is one of the richest blocs in the world. How much of this money is leaking? Is anyone even looking for the leaks? And two, this survey comes at a crucial time for Europe. They're set to approve a $687 billion rescue plan. $687 billion. Bailouts are harvest season for corrupt officials and corporates. Without oversight, money can be easily siphoned off. But the biggest blow is European prestige, the image of a clean, no-nonsense Europe. When disaster came, all that self-righteousness went down the drain. People bribed their way to hospital beds and vaccines. Now, don't get me wrong, things are not any better in the subcontinent. Greasing wheels is a way of life here, but sometimes it's important to set the record straight to show you how global challenges are often presented as third world problems. Why is this happening? And why so much in Europe? Well, that's something that we have discussed. Now to Qatar, the new favourite destination of India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar. He has made 2 visits to Qatar in less than a week. The first visit was on the 9th of June. Today, on his way back from Kenya, Jaishankar had a stopover in Qatar again. On both occasions, the External Affairs Minister said the meetings were to thank Qatar for its support during the second wave. Well, that's a lot of thanksgiving, one would think. As always, there's more to the story than meets the eye. The route for an Afghanistan peace deal goes through Doha, and India could be trying to get a word in. Our next report joins the dots.
2 visits in a span of 1 week. India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has made 2 stopovers in Doha. Last Wednesday, Jaishankar met with Qatar's National Security Advisor. Almost a week later, he was back in Doha, one-on-one with the Deputy Prime Minister. Why did For a while now, Doha has been the venue for peace talks between the representatives of the Afghan government and America's special Khalilzad is a frequent visitor to the city. In 2020, the United States and the Taliban signed a deal in Doha, the same agreement that has led to the American troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. So Doha is where the future of Afghanistan is being shaped. This is where key stakeholders are meeting and talking, and India doesn't want to be left behind. India has diplomatic, strategic and financial stakes in Afghanistan. They must be protected. So India is engaging with the host of the peace dialogue, Qatar, as well as the Taliban. Jaishankar's first stopover in Qatar came against the backdrop of key meetings in Doha. Reports say that hours after Jaishankar's departure, senior Qatari officials held separate meetings with Zalmay Khalilzad, as well as a team of Taliban negotiators. This comes amid reports that India has opened its own channel with the Taliban. It is believed that New Delhi has begun engaging with Mullah Baradar, the man who signed the agreement with America in February last year. New Delhi has a lot to protect in Afghanistan. It is running more than 400 development projects. They are spread out across all 34 provinces of Afghanistan. In November last year, India had announced an additional $80 million in aid for Afghanistan. This money will be spent on 150 projects. For these investments to succeed, India needs to maintain good ties with all stakeholders, from the elected leadership of Afghanistan to the Taliban. In recent weeks, India was the only major stakeholder in the region that wasn't engaging with the Taliban. But that's not something New Delhi can afford anymore. Reports say at least 30 districts in Afghanistan have fallen to the Taliban. American troops are leaving. The changing power equations are evident, and India is making the right moves by adapting its policy to the changing ground realities in Afghanistan. Bureau Report, World is One.
Our last story tonight is from Saudi Arabia. The kingdom has adopted another reform, one that would allow women to travel alone and live independently without seeking the permission of their male guardian. That's right. Up until now, Saudi women could not do that. They had to seek their family's consent under the male guardianship system. Now, things are set to change, and this is not a standalone decision. It follows a string of reforms that are being undertaken by the kingdom to modernize Saudi society. Here's a report.
Saudi Arabia has adopted a new legal amendment which allows Saudi women to live on their own. It may not sound like much of a reform to many, but in a country where women cannot live independently without their family's consent, this is a major step towards empowering them and ending the abuse of the male guardianship system. According to reports, Saudi legal authorities have removed certain paragraphs from Article 169 of the Sharia law. This paragraph stated that a male guardian is to look after any single divorced or widowed woman. This bestowed male guardians with the power to decide where the women stay, where they travel, and who they travel with. It also stopped women from traveling abroad without the approval of their male guardian. Time and again, this led to many families filing lawsuits against their daughters and wives who chose to live or travel alone. Now, the law has been altered, and it states the following things. An adult woman has the right to choose where to live. 2. A male guardian can no longer file lawsuits if a woman decides to live alone. 3. A male guardian can only file a report if he has evidence of a crime committed. 4. Even if a woman is sentenced to a jail term for a crime, she will not be handed to her guardian upon completion of the sentence. And 5. A passport will be granted to any Saudi woman who wants to travel alone. This decision comes after high-profile attempts by Saudi women to escape their families. In 2019, a probe was ordered into how the male guardianship system was being abused. 2 years later, a major rehaul is underway. It follows a string of reforms of Saudi Arabia. This includes lifting a decades-old ban on women driving cars, easing gender segregation in public places, curbing the powers of the religious police, removing a 35-year prohibition on cinemas, and allowing restaurants to play music. The pace of the current changes in Saudi Arabia is unprecedented. It signals the opening up and modernization of the Saudi society, with the aim of improving the monarchy's image as it moves towards this goal. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Well, better late than never. On that note, we're wrapping, leaving you as always with Gravitas Images. Thanks very much for watching.
Look one side of the building.